Andy Burnham is days away from number 10 and speculation is rife on who he's going to move in next door as Chancellor, with talk that Ed Miliband's chances are now over. We'll see. Robert, what do you think?
I'm told, by people who genuinely are close to Andy Burnham, that he does know who he wants to appoint for all the big cabinet jobs. I mean, we haven't got long to wait. He's going to announce them on Monday. And that he is making those appointments on the basis of who he thinks is best for the job, rather than because he's done some prior deal with some member of the cabinet who was particularly helpful in, forcing Starmer out, or making everything terribly unstable, which would allow Burnham in. So he's allegedly he's not done any deals with anyone. Nobody's been sort of helpful to him in a way that has secured them the job of their dreams. That's what these colleagues say. If that's right, that's what, as I say, I've been told. That would take away one of the reasons many people have speculated that it must be Ed Miliband for Chancellor, because Ed Miliband was one of a small number of members of the cabinet who told Starmer his time was up and it was time to go. So what I'm trying to work out is, having been told that, is whether that is a code for, and therefore Ed Miliband is not going to get the job. To be honest, I never thought that was why he was going to get the job. There were two other reasons why I thought he might get the job, and these still hold. One is that he is one of, I've talked about this before on the podcast, only two senior members of the cabinet who really know the Treasury very well. They are, Ed, who worked there for donkey's years for Gordon Brown as one of his advisors, and Yvette Cooper, who was Chief Secretary for a period. Now, interestingly, for that reason, I am beginning to hear the name of Yvette Cooper being mentioned as a possible Chancellor in a way that I wasn't hearing a few days ago. Then there's a final factor in all of this, which is no Prime Minister wants to start their reign with somebody powerful within the party wanting to destabilise them. And the question, it seems to me, that if he's not going to give Ed Miliband the job of Chancellor, which is, as I understand it, a job he massively cherishes, how does he make sure that Ed doesn't, in whatever job he has, or possibly even from the back benches, just decide he's going to make life very difficult for Andy Burnham? And you would not want Ed Miliband as an enemy, particularly early in your time as Prime Minister. So these are not easy decisions.
I want to talk about the rest of the cabinet in a second, but let's just talk about Ed. You and I have both known him for years and years. He was leader of the Labour Party in the run-up to the 2015 election when I was political editor of ITV, and so I spent a lot of time with him. I have to admit candidly, I always really liked him, thought he was pretty smart, was much nicer than the public and much more able, honestly, than the public seemed to think he was. I thought the whole business about that ridiculous bacon sandwich and how that was made to seem a thing was absolutely absurd, and honestly, the media at its worst. I mean, you can make anyone look like an idiot for eating a sandwich badly. It was just, it sort of trivialized our politics and made it absurd in the most honestly embarrassing way possible. Look, I'm not saying he doesn't have his flaws as a politician. I think he had his slightly nasal voice annoyed a lot of people, and that kind of, helped people caricature him quite easily. And it was interesting watching him up against David Cameron. I mean, I've no idea whether he'd make a good Chancellor. I'd no idea whether Yvette or Shabana or any of the other names touted would make a better Chancellor. And truthfully, I think the honest answer is that we never know until someone walks into a big job how they're going to cut it. But I find it a little hard to credit the arguments that the markets would be spooked or he'd be much more left-wing than the others. I mean, what do you think of Ed generally as a kind of politician, and what do you think of the argument that the markets would be spooked, or he would be, very different from a lot of the other candidates?
What I think is that if you look at successful chancellors, or at least chancellors who are successful for a while at least, Geoffrey Howe, Nigel Lawson, Gordon Brown. Obviously, there's a debate about George Osborne. Some people love him, some people hate him. But my God, he was an important chancellor, right? He did some big stuff.
Consequential,
right?
For sure.
He was consequential, right? The important chancellors are ones who have a clear vision of what they want to do. And if I look around the potential contenders to be chancellor, I have to say, simply on the basis of what they've revealed, the only one I can see who seems to have a sort of vision for how you run an economy, and let's be clear, it's been confined to the extraordinarily important economic area of energy, and a lot of people hate what he's done in that area, but he does have what you might call a vision and a concept, and indeed, as I say, knowledge of the Treasury. The others who are mentioned as potential chancellors, I mean, it's possible that they are, Nigel Lawson's or Gordon Brown's just hidden, and just because of the nature of their jobs, they've not been able to talk at all about how they see the future competitiveness of the UK and how they would generate growth. It is possible that Shabana Mahmood has such big ideas, but we don't know because she's never given any kind of a speech that would, reveal anything about any of that. Yvette Cooper, lives in a household with Ed Balls who live and breathe economics, and it is therefore absolutely conceivable that she does have some great vision for the British economy. But, she for years was immersed in home affairs, both in opposition and then as Home Secretary, and now she's Foreign Secretary. She's not. So, I mean, genuinely, although, I know Yvette Cooper very well, I don't talk to her about economics ever. So I just don't know what her economic approach would be. Now, it is true, the one recent member of the cabinet who was given a big economic speech in the last few weeks is Wes Streeting. And it is equally interesting that, Wes Streeting and Andy Burnham have recently said that they have an enormous amount in common economically. So maybe, and he's never touted as possible chancellor these days, and maybe, Wes is a possible candidate for that. I mean, I'm going to say again, I don't genuinely know. The one reason why I wonder whether Wes is a candidate is because I read what was really quite an important and quite big economic speech that he gave. The one thing it didn't mention anywhere was Andy Burnham's biggest idea revealed to date, which is to transfer vast amounts of what you might consider to be not only the powers of other departments, but Treasury powers to the regions, to mayors, to, local governments, to combined authorities. There was nothing about devolution in that speech at all, which I thought at the time was odd, given that Burnham was plainly on his way. Now, it doesn't mean to say that he doesn't believe in devolution. It's just if he was writing an application to be Chancellor, I wasn't sure that was his most astute application.
Let's talk about the rest of the cabinet. It is weird going away for a couple of weeks because it does allow you to view things through a different lens. And I found myself sitting there thinking, as I said at the start, yeah, partly the way British politics seems from afar is absolutely absurd sometimes. And the whole Burnham as this sort of unexamined messiah coming in is pretty weird. But at the same time, I thought to myself, well, he's a politician that's been around, he's had some success, he's reasonably charismatic, he's a good communicator, probably like the rest of the country, setting party politics aside. I hope it works out because goodness knows we could do with a good leader and some stability and some consistency, to be honest, in politics. And that led me to think the obvious thing, I guess, which is, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have yet another massive reshuffle? Because as we've discussed so often before, it's not just that we keep changing leaders that's so bad for the country and its governance. It's the fact that every time you change a leader, and quite often plenty of times in between times, you get a reshuffle. We all know that you can't really hope to have any impact in a government department for at least a year, if not longer. If you really want to change the terms of a department, you have to be in there for 3 or 4 years at a minimum. So I thought to myself, the logic to me was, okay, you come in, you keep Yvette as foreign secretary, she seems to be doing an okay job. Maybe you do put someone new like Miliband into the Treasury, because obviously he can't continue with Rachel Reeves. But, why not put Angela Rayner back in housing? Why not put Wes Streeting back in health and saying, listen, you were doing a job, let's just get on with it? I mean, what do you think of my logic there? Is that basically faulty? And how do you think he's thinking about it?
I don't know, because allegedly he has thought it all through, but is not telling anybody what his conclusions are. I mean, what I was told about these various stories about appointments is, none of them are, in a sense, deliberately being put out by Burnham. They are literally being put out by people who want this or that different outcome. This is jockeying for position. So what do we know about Burnham, right? What he has said is he does not want the kind of sectarianism that characterized so much of the Starmer's time in office. So, and this was characterized by both people, particularly early on in the lifetime of this government, who just criticized the Prime Minister's policy on this or that being thrown out of the party. I mean, the classic sort of madness was when a whole bunch of people on the so-called soft and slightly harder left stood up very early on and said the 2-child limit on universal credit should be abolished. They were all thrown out. Only months later, this was Keir Starmer's proudest achievement, abolishing the 2-child limit on universal credit. I mean, it was sort of as sort of completely pointless ways, as a completely pointless method of making yourself unpopular. It was hard to, it was hard to beat. And it was so different from Tony Blair, because not only did Tony Blair put up with, endless criticism from the left, he even invited some of those people into his cabinet, people like Claire Short and, Robin Cook, of course. I mean, it was a constant critic. And so one of the things Burnham has said is he wants to heal the divisions in the party by encouraging debate between left and right and having all those parts of the party represented in his government. So, my own view would be he'll very likely give Becky Long-Bailey, who was a candidate to be leader in that election that Keir Starmer won, but was then forced out over some tweet, an ill-advised tweet. She was sacked and has been in the wilderness. I'd be very surprised, given that she's, a bright, impressive person, if she wasn't invited back in some way, maybe in a junior post. But he does need, because part of his appeal to the party is, I am the healer, I am the person who will encourage debate. So his cabinet, again, I think will have to reflect some of that. Obviously, Lou Haigh, who has been, one of his great campaigners, but was sacked by Starmer from Transport Secretary, will be back in the cabinet, probably as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, in that sort of rather important sort of central, pulling everything together kind of role. I imagine Lucy Powell, another great supporter, currently deputy leader of the Labour Party, will be in the cabinet properly, and there'll be others of those supporters who will be given important jobs. So there's a balance to be struck between both rewarding his allies, showing that he is a party of all the sort of views and talents, and keeping a little bit, at least, of stability.
Let's talk about the handover, because we should say that we're recording this before the England semi-final, so we don't know whether England are going to progress to the final or not. And obviously we're going to be at quite the moment in certainly the English nation's history. If we go into Sunday in another World Cup final, it will of course be Keir Starmer's last full day in power. He's indicated already that if we make it to the final, he's going to be there. By the time you're listening to this, we may indeed have lost the semi-final if things go badly for England tonight. But whatever happens, Robert, you and I will be standing in Downing Street once again on Monday, seeing a Prime Minister out and another Prime Minister in, the seventh in 10 years, as we've said numerous times. Talk us through, for those that don't know, talk us through the kind of handover of power. People are familiar with the trip to the palace for the outgoing Prime Minister, the trip to the palace for the incoming Prime Minister, where the King asks him to form a government and so on. What do you think about the kind of logistics of that day and the politics of that day, and how it's likely to pan out in the first day or two?
Well, we'll get the cabinet announced in the afternoon after Andy Burnham is installed in Downing Street. And as you say, one of the uncertainties is around whether it's sort of late morning or early afternoon, and the slight uncertainty is over not only whether, because I mean, Starmer, as you say, is going to go to the World Cup final if England are in the World Cup final, but air travel being what it is, it can't be 100% certain what time he'll arrive back, and will have packed up his last remaining socks and underwear before moving out, as it were. So
there's a thought.
But my best guess is all of this will have happened. My best guess is that by 2 or 3 o'clock, Andy Burnham will be Prime Minister, and then we will have that wonderful ritual of MPs walking down Downing Street to be given either the good news or, if they're not getting the jobs they want, the bad news. And I'm assuming, by the way, that unlike Keir Starmer, this is a Prime Minister who will, anybody who's got very bad news, i.e., this is, good luck and goodbye, will be rung up not by some flunky or junior person, but will be rung up by Andy Burnham. One of the reasons why Keir Starmer made himself so unpopular with so many people is that when there were reshuffles and sackings, he himself very rarely actually talked to the disappointed or chastised individual. He left it to others, and that, I mean, and it left people feeling very sore. Obviously, if you're sacked, you're not going to feel overwhelmingly loyal to the person who sacked you, but there are ways of doing it so that you're perhaps less of a troublemaker. And there are also ways of doing it which might make you think, well, maybe I can come back one day. Anyway, that one of Keir Starmer's signal weaknesses or failings was to delegate a lot of the bad news, a lot of the telling of bad news. And as I say, Burnham is supposed to be a people person, so presumably as a people person, he will deliver both the good news and the bad news. We'll see. We will see. On Friday, we've got his victory. Is victory the right word? There are really no other candidates, but he'll become leader of the Labour. He'll become leader of the Labour Party.
I think victory is the right word.
No. Anyway, so he becomes leader of the Labour Party on Friday. He will give what is being described to me as a big positioning speech, ideas, values, but no policy. And then we will move after Monday into a few days of announcing what is being described to me as relatively modest policy initiatives, presumably all in the territory of helping people with the cost of living, since he has said his big priority initially is to help people with the cost of living. So, maybe there will be some announcements around, energy bills as a result, that are going up as a result of Trump's war in Iran. Maybe there'll be some minor tinkering with tax or whatever. Anyway, we'll we'll get that. I'm reliably told there will be nothing too radical initially, even though allegedly he's going to be radical one day. And that's because Trump's war in Iran has flared up again, and oil prices rising. The price of government bonds is falling, and the interest rates that governments pay is rising again. And because we are in the ugly contest among sovereign borrowers, we are regarded by investors as the ugliest. Whenever we get into a period of instability like this, where people are cautious about lending to governments, they're always most cautious about lending to the UK. So actually, one of the reasons, you were talking earlier about the market risk of appointing Ed Miliband. It is, it is a delicate moment to appoint anybody to a job like Chancellor. Unless that Chancellor moves very, very fast to reassure markets that they're not going to play fast and loose with the public finances, and that's largely because of Trump's of the instability in financial markets caused by Trump's war in Iran. So if in the end Miliband doesn't get the job, maybe he needs to blame, Donald Trump. There's another reason, just briefly, because we might as well go back to where we started for a moment. The other thing, which I regard as absolutely nuts, but nonetheless another reason why he may not be appointed, is because historically he has been opposed to granting licenses to the Jackdaw and Rosebank fields for additional gas and oil exploitation of the North Sea. To be clear, economically these are not massive decisions. Allegedly, Ed Miliband is persuadable to stop his opposition to the granting of these licenses. I think Andy Burnham does want that kind of exploitation in the North Sea. But one of the things that Ed Miliband has achieved for himself in opposing that exploitation is a number of quite important trade union leaders hate him because he's blocked it. And that's another reason why, his appointment, it's not so much. The problem for Ed at the moment is, people are wary of him, or what you might call on the right in financial markets and on the left in trade unions, which is an uncomfortable position for him to be in.
One final thing I just wanted to talk about briefly before we go, partly because I haven't had a chance to chat to you since a lot of this has happened.
Yeah.
We've had Ann Widdecombe's terrible murder. You and I have dealt with her for years, and I think, as others have said, she was extraordinarily sort of courteous and charming when she dealt with you, whatever people may have thought of her politics. And it's just so despicable and awful. And I think there are issues that are really bothering me around the safety of our MPs. And I think one has to understand that there's quite a lot of that in Nigel Farage's mind, and understandably so, but equally well in the minds of all MPs. I know Anne was no longer an MP, but she was a spokesperson for her party. When you're watching from miles away Nigel Farage's sort of resignation and all the rest of it, it just seems so bizarre. I couldn't just quite get my head round it. And then I started to think a lot about the donation. And I just kept on thinking, I know the issue is really whether he, why he didn't declare it. But like 5 million is just an awful lot for anyone to give anyone. Even very rich people don't normally go around giving 5 million gifts. And the whole thing just struck me as very, very bizarre from beginning to end, really. And the question that I wanted to discuss with you is, I just kept on coming back and back to whether it really has harmed reform or not.
Yeah, I think it's significantly damaged reform. One of the things when I talk to voters, they thought that Farage wasn't as bad, as all the other MPs who they see as on the take, and now they think Farage is, just another politician. And so that's in itself incredibly bad for Farage. In fairness, no other politician that I know of has received a £5 million gift. Nobody's saying it's illegal to get a £5 million gift. Not to disclose it, we will find out whether it's broken the rules.
It's bloody unusual.
Normal people don't get given £5 million by mates, and so people, because it comes against the backdrop of tremendous disillusionment with the probity of our MPs. The last thing he needed was to be in a sense, tarnished in that way. So that's number one. Number two, it is really terrible for him that he is running a campaign against Count Binface. The fact that all the
Funny,
other,
but terrible.
but I mean, he looks ridiculous now, right?
Agreed.
And there is also, just to be absolutely clear, okay, if he won less than 50% or fewer than 50% of the votes in the general election, there is a theoretical possibility if everybody who hates reform in Clacton were to vote for Count Binface, Nigel Farage could lose. Right now, I think that's very unlikely to happen because Nigel Farage has very, very passionate supporters, and they are more likely to vote than loads of people who are just disillusioned with politics. But if Count Binface, if Nigel Farage's share of the vote in Clacton were to fall compared to the general election, and Count Binface was to get a significant vote, that would be incredibly damaging. Again, humiliating for Nigel Farage. So again, his judgment here in resigning in these circumstances looks bad. And then just one other thing I want to say, okay, and it is this, because you talked about the shocking murder of Ann Widdecombe, which is profoundly upsetting. And what I would say, the reason I find it very upsetting and disturbing is because she was one of those sort of old school people who was tough. She spoke her mind, but she was always courteous and respectful. Always. Right? She did not engage in the politics of vitriol and hate, which has infected our politics. Right? And she represents the kind of approach to politics which I massively value. There are many, many, many people who, dislike her social conservatism and her love of Brexit. And she actively disliked many of the policies of those on the left, but she never engaged in, the kind of personal nasty attacks that so much of politics has become. And, for her to be murdered, and it is possible that the police have said that the murderer was politically motivated. I find this really, this takes the degradation of political discourse in this country to a desperate new low. And I begin to worry that we are closer to the kind of violence in politics that characterizes America than we've ever been. And that would be terrible.
Amen to all that. Couldn't agree more. We probably better leave it there. So for this week's episode, it is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.